The morning mist hung low over the Norman countryside as General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt stood at the window of his headquarters, studying intelligence reports that should have brought him satisfaction, but instead filled him with growing unease. It was August 1944, and the Allied forces that had landed on the beaches of Normandy 2 months earlier were supposed to be withering under the weight of their own logistical impossibilities. According to every calculation, every precedent, every lesson learned from years of warfare across Europe, the American and British forces should have been running out of fuel, ammunition, and supplies. Their advance should have ground to a halt as their supply lines stretched beyond breaking point across the devastated landscape of northern France. Instead, the report spoke of American armored divisions racing across France with seemingly unlimited fuel, of artillery batteries firing continuous barrages without apparent concern for ammunition conservation, of infantry units advancing with equipment and supplies that appeared to materialize from thin air. The German generals who had spent years perfecting the art of lightning warfare, who had conquered most of Europe through superior logistics and operational planning, found themselves facing an enemy whose logistical capabilities seemed to defy every known principle of military science. For the German High Command, this was more than just a tactical surprise. It was a fundamental challenge to their understanding of how modern warfare worked. They had built their entire military doctrine around the principle that logistics determined the limits of operational possibility. Their greatest victories had come from moving faster and more efficiently than their enemies, from concentrating superior force at decisive points, while their opponents struggled with the mundane but crucial tasks of keeping their armies fed, fueled, and supplied. The idea that the Americans, whom German intelligence had consistently characterized as industrially capable but militarily inexperienced, could somehow solve logistical problems that had stymied professional armies for centuries seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet the evidence was mounting daily that something unprecedented was happening behind Allied lines, something that was allowing American forces to maintain an operational tempo that should have been impossible given the constraints of time, distance, and available transportation infrastructure. What the German generals didn't yet fully understand was that they were witnessing the birth of a logistical operation so massive, so audacious, and so effective that it would fundamentally change their understanding of what was possible in modern warfare. The Red Ball Express, as it would come to be known, represented not just a solution to an immediate tactical problem, but a revolution in military logistics that would help determine the outcome of the war in Western Europe. Before we delve into this remarkable story of innovation, determination, and the triumph of American industrial might over German military tradition, I want to provide a warm warning that all specific characters, personal details, and individual conversations in this narrative are fictional representations created for storytelling purposes. While the historical events and general circumstances are based on documented history, any particular personal characterizations or dialogue that might resonate with real individuals are purely coincidental. The story of how German confidence in their logistical superiority crumbled in the face of American innovation begins not with the Red Ball Express itself, but with the years of success that had convinced German military leaders that they understood the fundamental limitations of modern warfare better than any of their enemies. The German military machine that rolled across Europe in the early years of World War II was built on a foundation of logistical precision that had been refined through decades of careful study and practical experience. The concept of blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was not simply about moving fast and hitting hard. It was about creating a perfect synthesis between tactical mobility, operational planning, and logistical support that would allow German forces to achieve decisive victories before their enemies could respond effectively. At the heart of German military thinking was the understanding that modern armies were incredibly complex organisms that required constant feeding with fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and countless other supplies. The side that could move these supplies most efficiently, that could maintain the highest operational tempo while keeping their forces properly supplied, would possess a decisive advantage over enemies who were forced to slow down or halt their operations while they waited for their logistics to catch up. General Feldmarschall Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine, had demonstrated repeatedly that properly supplied panzer divisions could move faster and strike harder than any enemy force could respond to. His campaigns had shown that the key to victory lay not just in having superior tanks or better trained crews, but in creating logistical systems that could keep those tanks moving and fighting regardless of distance from their starting points or the condition of local transportation infrastructure. The German success in the early war years had created a dangerous sense of confidence among the high command about their understanding of logistical limitations. They had seen British forces in Norway struggle with supply problems that German units had solved effortlessly. They had watched French armies collapse not just because of tactical defeats, but because their logistical systems couldn't adapt quickly enough to the pace of German operations. They had observed Soviet forces in the early months of Operation Barbarossa making elementary mistakes in supply planning that German staff officers had learned to avoid years earlier. These calculations were not mere guesswork. They were based on solid intelligence about American equipment, detailed knowledge of French transportation infrastructure, and years of practical experience in conducting mobile operations across similar terrain. German staff officers had access to captured American field manuals, detailed reports from German agents about American industrial production, and comprehensive intelligence about Allied shipping capabilities and port facilities. This assessment seemed to be confirmed by early observations of American forces in North Africa and Italy, where German commanders had noted what they interpreted as excessive caution and rigid adherence to predetermined plans. American units appeared to advance only when they were certain of adequate supply support, and they seemed reluctant to exploit tactical successes if doing so would strain their logistical capabilities. The German evaluation of American logistics was also influenced by cultural biases that led them to underestimate the innovative potential of American military leadership. German officers, trained in a tradition that emphasized careful planning and systematic execution, found it difficult to imagine that their enemies might develop entirely new approaches to logistical problems. They assumed that American forces would be constrained by the same limitations that had governed military operations throughout history, and that superior German experience and training would provide decisive advantages in any prolonged campaign. The German intelligence assessment of American logistical capabilities in the months leading up to D-Day reflected a curious mixture of respect and dismissal that would prove to be catastrophically inaccurate. German analysts acknowledged that American industrial production was impressive in terms of sheer volume. The United States was clearly capable of producing vast quantities of tanks, trucks, aircraft, and other military equipment. What they questioned was whether Americans possessed the military sophistication necessary to translate this industrial capacity into effective battlefield logistics. German intelligence reports from this period reveal a consistent pattern of underestimating American adaptability and innovation. The reports acknowledged American strengths in mass production and standardization, noting that American factories could produce military equipment in quantities that German industry could never match. However, these same reports consistently concluded that quantity could not substitute for quality, and that American emphasis on mass production would result in logistical systems that were inflexible and vulnerable to disruption. The German assessment was based partly on their observation of American military culture, which they interpreted through the lens of their own military traditions. German officers, trained in a system that emphasized individual initiative and tactical flexibility, found it difficult to understand how American emphasis on systematic procedures and standardized equipment could produce effective military results. They saw American reliance on detailed planning and extensive preparation as evidence of inflexibility rather than thoroughness. This cultural misunderstanding led German intelligence to consistently underestimate the potential for American forces to develop innovative solutions to logistical challenges. German analysts assumed that American commanders would be constrained by rigid adherence to established procedures, and that they would be unable to adapt quickly when those procedures proved inadequate to meet changing battlefield conditions. The German evaluation was also influenced by their assessment of American personnel quality, particularly in the crucial area of logistics and transportation. German intelligence had concluded that American truck drivers, supply officers, and logistics personnel lacked the training and experience necessary to maintain complex supply operations under combat conditions. They believed that American logistics would work adequately in peacetime or in static situations, but would break down quickly when subjected to the stress and confusion of mobile warfare. This assessment seemed to be supported by German observations of early American operations in North Africa, where logistical problems had indeed caused significant difficulties for American forces. German commanders had noted instances where American units had been forced to halt operations due to supply shortages, and they had observed what appeared to be inefficient use of available transportation resources. What German intelligence failed to recognize was that these early difficulties represented learning experiences rather than fundamental limitations. American military leadership was systematically analyzing the lessons of each operation, identifying weaknesses in their logistical procedures, and developing improved methods for future campaigns. The American approach to military logistics was evolving rapidly, driven by the same innovative spirit that had made American industry so productive. The German assessment also failed to account for the unique advantages that American industrial culture brought to military logistics. American civilian transportation and logistics industries had developed sophisticated methods for moving large quantities of goods across vast distances, and many of the personnel who would later manage military supply operations had extensive experience in civilian logistics and transportation management. Perhaps most importantly, German intelligence underestimated the extent to which American military planners were willing to commit resources to solving logistical problems. The German military tradition emphasized efficiency and economy, seeking to achieve maximum results with minimum expenditure of resources. American planners, backed by seemingly unlimited industrial capacity, were prepared to commit whatever resources were necessary to ensure that their forces remained adequately supplied regardless of the cost or complexity involved. This fundamental difference in approach would prove crucial in the months following D-Day. While German forces were constrained by increasingly limited resources and were forced to make difficult choices about where to allocate their available supplies, American forces were supported by a logistical system that was designed to provide abundance rather than mere adequacy. The German failure to understand American logistical potential was also influenced by their assessment of American strategic priorities. German intelligence assumed that American forces would be constrained by the need to support multiple theaters of operations simultaneously, and that resources committed to the European theater would necessarily be limited by competing demands from the Pacific War and other global commitments. What they failed to anticipate was the extent to which American industrial production had expanded to meet all of these demands simultaneously. The American economy had been transformed by the war effort, with production capacity increasing to levels that seemed almost incomprehensible to German planners who were struggling with increasingly severe resource constraints. The Grey Dawn of June 6, 1944, brought with it the largest amphibious invasion in military history, but for the German commanders watching Allied forces struggle ashore on the beaches of Normandy, the initial landings seemed to confirm many of their preconceptions about American and British logistical limitations. The Allied forces that fought their way inland from the beaches were clearly well equipped and determined, but they were also operating at the very end of an extremely tenuous supply line that stretched back across the English Channel to ports in Britain. German intelligence had calculated that the Allies would face enormous challenges in maintaining adequate supplies for large-scale operations in France. The invasion forces would be dependent initially on supplies brought directly across the beaches, a notoriously inefficient and weather-dependent method of logistics that had historically proven inadequate for supporting major military operations. Even if the Allies succeeded in capturing port facilities, German demolitions and the natural limitations of available ports would severely constrain the volume of supplies that could be brought ashore. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in northern France, had spent months preparing defensive positions based on the assumption that Allied forces would be most vulnerable during the critical period when they were establishing their logistical base in France. His strategy was to contain the initial landings long enough for logistical constraints to force the Allies to slow their advance, creating opportunities for German counterattacks that could drive the invaders back into the sea. The initial weeks following D-Day seemed to validate this approach. Allied forces advanced slowly and methodically, taking time to consolidate their positions and build up supplies before attempting major offensive operations. German commanders noted with satisfaction that American and British units appeared to be operating under severe logistical constraints, advancing only when they were certain of adequate supply support and showing reluctance to exploit tactical successes that might outrun their supply lines. The battle for the port of Cherbourg illustrated what German commanders saw as typical Allied logistical thinking. Instead of bypassing the port and continuing their advance inland, Allied forces committed significant resources to capturing and rebuilding Cherbourg's port facilities. This seemed to confirm German assessments that Allied operations were constrained by conventional logistical thinking and that American commanders lacked the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. German confidence in their assessment of Allied logistical limitations was further reinforced by their observations of the bocage fighting in Normandy. The dense hedgerow country of northern France was ideal defensive terrain that channeled Allied advances along predictable routes and limited the effectiveness of Allied advantages in armor and artillery. German forces were able to conduct a fighting withdrawal that imposed heavy casualties on advancing Allied units while forcing them to consume enormous quantities of ammunition and fuel. The slow pace of Allied advance through the bocage seemed to confirm that American and British forces were indeed constrained by the logistical limitations that German planners had predicted. Allied units advanced methodically, taking time to bring up supplies and reinforcements before attempting to continue their advance. This cautious approach was interpreted by German commanders as evidence that Allied logistics were operating at the very limits of their capabilities. What German intelligence failed to recognize was that the apparent caution of Allied operations during this period reflected strategic planning rather than logistical constraints. Allied commanders were deliberately building up overwhelming superiority in men and materials before attempting the breakout operations that would determine the fate of the Normandy campaign. The methodical pace of Allied advance was not a sign of weakness, but preparation for operations of unprecedented scale and intensity. The German assessment of Allied logistical capabilities was also influenced by their own increasingly desperate supply situation. German forces in Normandy were operating under severe constraints, with fuel and ammunition shortages limiting their ability to conduct mobile operations or maintain sustained defensive actions. German commanders found it difficult to imagine that their enemies might be operating under fundamentally different logistical conditions. The breakthrough came in late July with Operation Cobra, the American offensive that finally broke through German defensive lines and opened the way for rapid advances across France. The speed and scale of the American breakout caught German commanders completely off guard, not just tactically but logistically. Within days of the initial breakthrough, American armored divisions were racing across France at a pace that should have been impossible to sustain given conventional understanding of supply limitations. General Omar Bradley's First Army and General George Patton's newly activated Third Army were advancing so rapidly that German intelligence officers struggled to keep track of their positions. American armored spearheads were covering distances in single days that German planners had calculated would require weeks to traverse while maintaining adequate supplies. The fuel consumption alone should have forced American units to halt their advance within days, yet somehow they continued to move at full speed across hundreds of miles of French countryside. German commanders found themselves facing a logistical puzzle that challenged everything they thought they knew about the limitations of mobile warfare. American divisions were operating at distances from their supply bases that should have made sustained operations impossible, yet they showed no signs of slowing down. Artillery units were firing continuous barrages without apparent concern for ammunition conservation. Tank units were advancing without the careful fuel management that German doctrine considered essential for extended operations. The German response to the American breakout revealed the extent to which their own logistical thinking had become rigid and predictable. German commanders attempted to establish defensive lines based on their calculations of where American advances would be forced to halt due to supply constraints. When American forces continued to advance past these predicted stopping points, German defensive preparations were rendered useless, and entire army groups found themselves outflanked and cut off. General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge, who had replaced Rommel as commander of Army Group B, found himself trying to coordinate defensive operations against an enemy whose movements seemed to defy logical explanation. His staff officers provided him with detailed calculations showing that American armored spearheads should have run out of fuel days earlier, yet intelligence reports continued to show these same units advancing at maximum speed toward objectives that should have been beyond their operational reach. The psychological impact on German commanders was perhaps even more significant than the immediate tactical consequences. Officers who had built their careers on understanding the mathematical relationships between distance, time, and logistical capacity found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to operate outside these fundamental constraints. The confidence that had sustained German military leadership through years of successful operations began to erode as they struggled to comprehend how their enemies had achieved what appeared to be impossible. The logistical miracle that so confounded German intelligence had its origins in a crisis that developed in late August 1944 as American forces raced across France faster than anyone had thought possible. The very success of the breakout from Normandy had created a problem that threatened to bring the entire Allied advance to a grinding halt. The supply lines that had been adequate for supporting methodical advances through the bocage were completely inadequate for maintaining the breakneck pace of Patton's armored spearheads. The mathematics of the situation were stark and unforgiving. American forces were now operating at distances of 300 to 400 miles from their supply bases in Normandy, connected by a single railroad line that had been heavily damaged by German demolitions and Allied bombing. The port facilities at Cherbourg, while operational, were handling far more cargo than they had been designed for, and the transportation network between the ports and the advancing armies was stretched beyond its breaking point. General John C. H. Lee, commanding the services of supply for the European theater, faced a logistical challenge that would have seemed impossible to solve using conventional methods. American armored divisions were consuming fuel at rates that exceeded all pre-war calculations. Artillery units were firing ammunition faster than it could be transported to the front, and the entire Allied advance threatened to collapse under the weight of its own success. The solution that emerged from this crisis was as audacious as it was unprecedented. Instead of accepting the conventional wisdom that supply lines could only be extended gradually and methodically, American logistical planners decided to create an entirely new transportation system that would bypass existing infrastructure and deliver supplies directly to advancing combat units, regardless of distance or terrain obstacles. The Red Ball Express, as this system came to be known, was conceived as a massive convoy operation that would use dedicated highways to move supplies from Normandy to forward supply points near the front lines. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. Thousands of trucks would operate around the clock, carrying everything from gasoline and ammunition to food and medical supplies across hundreds of miles of French countryside. The organizational challenge was enormous. The operation would require not just trucks and drivers, but an entire support infrastructure including maintenance facilities, fuel depots, traffic control points, and communication networks. Routes would have to be surveyed and marked, bridges would have to be reinforced to handle heavy traffic, and security would have to be provided for convoys carrying vital supplies through areas that might still contain German forces. What made the Red Ball Express truly revolutionary was not just its scale, but its approach to solving logistical problems. Instead of trying to work within existing limitations, American planners simply decided to overwhelm those limitations through the application of massive resources and innovative thinking. If existing roads couldn't handle the required traffic volume, they would dedicate entire highways exclusively to military supply convoys. If conventional supply procedures were too slow, they would develop new procedures that prioritized speed over efficiency. The personnel requirements for the operation were staggering. The Red Ball Express would eventually employ over 5,000 drivers, most of them African-American soldiers who had been assigned to transportation units despite their desire to serve in combat roles. These men would become the unsung heroes of the operation, driving their trucks through enemy territory, adverse weather, and mechanical breakdowns to ensure that American combat units never ran short of essential supplies. The trucks themselves represented a triumph of American industrial standardization. The operation relied primarily on the GMC CCKW, a 2.5-ton truck that had been designed specifically for military use and could operate reliably under conditions that would disable civilian vehicles. These trucks were rugged, reliable, and simple enough to be maintained by drivers with minimal mechanical training, making them ideal for the demanding conditions of the Red Ball Express. The route selection process revealed the sophisticated planning that went into every aspect of the operation. American engineers surveyed multiple possible routes between Normandy and the front lines, evaluating each for factors including road condition, bridge capacity, fuel availability, and security considerations. The final route selection created a one-way loop that minimized traffic congestion while maximizing the volume of supplies that could be moved in a given time period. The communication and control systems developed for the Red Ball Express were equally innovative. Radio networks connected convoy commanders with supply depots and forward units, allowing real-time adjustments to delivery schedules based on changing tactical requirements. Traffic control points managed the flow of convoys to prevent bottlenecks while ensuring that priority supplies reached their destinations on schedule. The maintenance and support infrastructure required for the operation was massive in scope. Mobile repair units were positioned along the routes to handle mechanical breakdowns. Fuel depots were established at regular intervals to keep the trucks running, and rest areas were created to allow drivers to maintain the demanding schedule of round-the-clock operations. The first Red Ball Express convoys rolled out of the supply depots near Cherbourg on August 25, 1944, beginning an operation that would fundamentally change German understanding of what was possible in military logistics. The sight of endless columns of American trucks moving at high speed along dedicated highways was unlike anything that had been seen before in military history, representing a scale of logistical effort that seemed to defy every known constraint of time, distance, and available resources. The statistics of the operation were staggering in their scope and implications. On a typical day, the Red Ball Express moved over 12,000 tons of supplies across distances that averaged more than 300 miles. The convoys operated 24 hours a day, with trucks departing supply depots every few minutes and maintaining average speeds that would have been impressive for civilian traffic under peacetime conditions. The drivers who made the operation possible worked under conditions that would have been considered impossible by conventional military standards. They drove for 12 to 16 hours at a stretch, navigating by maps and road signs through territory that had been battlefields just days or weeks earlier. Many of the routes passed through areas where German forces might still be operating, requiring drivers to maintain constant vigilance while managing vehicles loaded with highly explosive or flammable cargo. The maintenance requirements of the operation pushed American logistical capabilities to their absolute limits. Trucks operating under Red Ball Express conditions required far more frequent service than normal military vehicles, with engines, transmissions, and tires wearing out at rates that exceeded all previous experience. Mobile maintenance units worked around the clock to keep the trucks running, often performing major repairs under field conditions that would have challenged well-equipped civilian garages. The fuel consumption of the operation was enormous, requiring a complex network of fuel depots and tanker trucks to keep the convoys moving. The Red Ball Express trucks themselves consumed thousands of gallons of gasoline daily, representing a significant portion of the total fuel being delivered to combat units. This created a logistical paradox where a substantial portion of the supplies being transported was required to keep the transportation system itself operational. The impact on German defensive planning was immediate and devastating. German commanders had based their defensive strategies on calculations of where American advances would be forced to halt due to supply constraints. When American armored spearheads continued to advance at full speed past these predicted stopping points, German defensive positions became useless and entire army groups found themselves outflanked and surrounded. German intelligence officers struggled to understand how American forces were maintaining such high operational tempo across such vast distances. Their calculations showed that American fuel consumption should have forced a halt to offensive operations within days of the initial breakout, yet American tanks continued to advance at maximum speed toward objectives that should have been beyond their operational reach. The psychological impact on German forces was perhaps even more significant than the immediate tactical consequences. German soldiers who had been trained to believe in the superiority of their own logistical systems found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to possess unlimited supplies of everything needed for sustained combat operations. American artillery fired continuous barrages without apparent concern for ammunition conservation. American tanks advanced without the careful fuel management that German doctrine considered essential, and American infantry units operated with equipment and supplies that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The Red Ball Express also demonstrated the innovative problem-solving capabilities that German intelligence had consistently underestimated in American military leadership. When conventional supply methods proved inadequate, American commanders had simply invented new methods that bypassed traditional limitations. When existing transportation infrastructure couldn't handle the required volume of supplies, they had created dedicated supply routes that operated outside normal traffic patterns. The operation revealed the extent to which American industrial capacity could be mobilized to solve military problems. The thousands of trucks required for the Red Ball Express had been produced by American factories in quantities that German industry could never have matched. The fuel, spare parts, and other supplies required to keep the operation running represented a level of resource commitment that would have been impossible for any other nation to sustain. German attempts to disrupt the Red Ball Express through air attacks and sabotage proved largely ineffective. The scale of the operation was so vast that localized attacks could not significantly impact overall supply flow, and the redundancy built into the system allowed operations to continue even when individual convoys were lost or delayed. American fighter aircraft provided air cover for the supply routes, and security units protected key bridges and fuel depots from ground attack. The adaptability of the Red Ball Express system also impressed and dismayed German observers. When tactical requirements changed, the operation could redirect supplies to new destinations within hours. When weather or enemy action blocked primary routes, alternative routes were quickly established and put into operation. The flexibility that German intelligence had believed was impossible in American military operations was demonstrated daily by the smooth functioning of this massive logistical enterprise. The success of the Red Ball Express began to change German assessments of American military capabilities in fundamental ways. Officers who had dismissed American logistics as inflexible and inefficient were forced to acknowledge that their enemies had developed capabilities that exceeded anything in German experience. The operation demonstrated that American emphasis on industrial production and systematic planning could produce military results that were superior to traditional European approaches to logistics and supply. The reports filtering back to German high command throughout September 1944 painted a picture that challenged every assumption about American logistical capabilities that had guided German planning since the beginning of the war. Intelligence officers who had confidently predicted that Allied advances would grind to a halt due to supply constraints now found themselves trying to explain how American forces were maintaining offensive operations at distances and speeds that should have been impossible. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, who had taken command of Army Group B following von Kluge's suicide, received daily briefings that seemed to describe an enemy operating under entirely different physical laws than those that constrained German forces. American armored divisions were advancing 50 to 70 miles per day while maintaining full combat effectiveness. Artillery units were firing barrages that consumed more ammunition in a single day than German units received in a month, and infantry formations were operating with equipment and supply levels that German forces hadn't seen since the early days of the war. The psychological impact on German command structure was profound and demoralizing. Officers who had built their careers on understanding the mathematical relationships between logistics and operations found themselves facing an enemy whose capabilities seemed to transcend these fundamental constraints. The confidence that had sustained German military leadership through years of successful operations began to erode as they struggled to develop effective responses to American logistical superiority. German attempts to adapt their defensive strategies to account for American logistical capabilities revealed the extent to which their entire military doctrine had been based on assumptions that were no longer valid. Traditional German defensive planning relied on forcing enemies to extend their supply lines beyond sustainable limits, creating opportunities for counterattacks against overextended forces. When American forces proved capable of maintaining full combat effectiveness at distances that should have left them vulnerable, German defensive concepts became obsolete overnight. German sabotage efforts were similarly misdirected, targeting bridges and road junctions that could be quickly repaired or bypassed, rather than focusing on the more vulnerable fuel depots and maintenance facilities that kept the trucks running. The German approach to disrupting enemy logistics was based on their own experience with relatively fragile supply systems that could be crippled by attacks on key nodes, but the Red Ball Express had been designed specifically to operate despite such attacks. The cultural biases that had led German intelligence to underestimate American capabilities continued to influence their assessment of the Red Ball Express even after its success became undeniable. German officers found it difficult to accept that what they saw as wasteful and inefficient use of resources could produce superior military results. The American willingness to commit thousands of trucks and tens of thousands of personnel to a single logistical operation seemed to violate every principle of military economy that German doctrine considered fundamental. German attempts to develop their own equivalent to the Red Ball Express were hampered by resource constraints and doctrinal inflexibility. The German military had been organized around the principle of achieving maximum efficiency with minimum resources, and the concept of overwhelming logistical problems through massive resource commitment was foreign to their thinking. Even if German industry had been capable of producing the required trucks and equipment, German military culture would have resisted such an apparently wasteful approach to logistics. The impact of the Red Ball Express on German strategic planning was equally significant. German commanders had based their defensive strategies on the assumption that American advances would eventually outrun their supply lines, creating opportunities for German counterattacks. When it became clear that American forces could maintain offensive operations indefinitely regardless of distance from their bases, German strategic planning had to be completely reconsidered. The realization that American logistical capabilities exceeded all previous estimates forced German intelligence to reassess their understanding of American industrial capacity and military potential. If the Americans could commit such enormous resources to a single logistical operation while simultaneously supporting multiple other theaters of operation, then German calculations about the overall balance of forces in the war were fundamentally flawed. German officers who had dismissed American military leadership as inexperienced and inflexible were forced to acknowledge that their enemies had demonstrated innovative thinking and organizational capabilities that exceeded anything in German experience. The Red Ball Express represented not just a logistical achievement, but a fundamental reimagining of how military supply operations could be organized and executed. The failure of German attempts to counter the Red Ball Express also revealed the extent to which German military thinking had become rigid and predictable. German responses to American innovations followed established patterns that American planners had anticipated and prepared for. The flexibility and adaptability that had characterized German operations in the early war years had been replaced by adherence to doctrinal solutions that were no longer adequate for the challenges they faced. The Red Ball Express officially ceased operations on November 16, 1944, having delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies across more than 4 million truck miles of French countryside. By any measure, it represented one of the most successful logistical operations in military history, but its significance extended far beyond the immediate tactical impact on the campaign in Western Europe. The operation had fundamentally changed German understanding of what was possible in modern warfare and had shattered the confidence that had sustained German military leadership since the beginning of the war. The final statistics of the operation were staggering in their implications for future military planning. The Red Ball Express had moved enough supplies to support the advance of multiple army groups across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, maintaining an operational tempo that had been considered impossible by every previous standard of military logistics. The operation had demonstrated that American industrial capacity, properly organized and directed, could overcome logistical constraints that had limited military operations throughout history. For German military leadership, the lessons of the Red Ball Express were both clear and devastating. The operation had proven that American emphasis on industrial production and systematic organization could produce military capabilities that exceeded traditional European approaches to warfare. The German belief in the superiority of their own military culture and operational methods had been shattered by an enemy who had simply overwhelmed traditional limitations through the application of massive resources and innovative thinking. The psychological impact of the Red Ball Express on German forces extended far beyond its immediate logistical effects. German soldiers who had been trained to believe in the superiority of their own military system found themselves facing an enemy whose capabilities seemed to transcend every known constraint of time, distance, and available resources. The confidence that had sustained German forces through years of successful operations was replaced by a growing recognition that they were fighting an enemy whose potential they had fundamentally misunderstood. The operation also demonstrated the extent to which American military leadership had evolved since the early days of the war. The operation also demonstrated the extent to which American military leadership had evolved since the early days of the war. The same commanders whom German intelligence had dismissed as inexperienced and inflexible had proven capable of conceiving and executing logistical operations of unprecedented complexity and scale. The Red Ball Express represented not just an administrative achievement, but a fundamental reimagining of how military supply operations could be organized to support modern mobile warfare. The cultural lessons of the Red Ball Express were perhaps even more significant than its immediate military impact. The operation had shown that American emphasis on technology, standardization, and systematic organization could produce results that exceeded what traditional military cultures considered possible. The German belief that spiritual strength and individual initiative were the decisive factors in warfare had been challenged by an enemy who achieved superior results through superior organization and resource management. The long-term strategic implications of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond the immediate context of the campaign in Western Europe. The operation had demonstrated that American industrial capacity, when properly mobilized and directed, could support military operations on a scale that no other nation could match. This had profound implications for the post-war balance of power and for the future development of military doctrine and strategy. The technological innovations developed for the Red Ball Express also had lasting impact on both military and civilian logistics. The communication systems, traffic control methods, and maintenance procedures developed for the operation influenced the development of modern transportation and logistics systems. The lessons learned about managing large-scale vehicle operations under demanding conditions were applied to post-war highway construction and commercial transportation systems. The personnel who served with the Red Ball Express, particularly the African-American drivers who formed the backbone of the operation, had demonstrated capabilities and dedication that challenged prevailing assumptions about military service and racial integration. Their performance under the demanding conditions of the operation provided evidence that would later influence decisions about military integration and equal opportunity in the armed forces. The German military's failure to understand or effectively counter the Red Ball Express also revealed fundamental weaknesses in their intelligence and planning systems. The same analytical methods that had served them well in the early war years had proven inadequate for assessing an enemy whose approach to warfare was fundamentally different from their own. The German emphasis on efficiency and economy, while admirable in many respects, had blinded them to the potential of approaches that emphasized abundance and overwhelming force. The Red Ball Express had also demonstrated the importance of logistics in modern warfare in ways that would influence military thinking for generations to come. The operation showed that logistical capabilities could be as decisive as tactical skill or technological superiority in determining the outcome of military campaigns. Future military planners would have to account for the possibility that enemies might develop logistical capabilities that transcended traditional limitations. The end of the Red Ball Express marked not just the conclusion of a remarkable logistical operation, but the final collapse of German illusions about their own superiority and their enemies' limitations. The German generals who had laughed at American logistics in the early days of the war now found themselves presiding over the collapse of their own logistical systems, while facing an enemy whose capabilities seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The contrast between German and American logistical capabilities by late 1944 was stark and undeniable. While German forces struggled with severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and basic supplies, American forces operated with abundance that seemed almost wasteful by German standards. The Red Ball Express had become a symbol of American industrial might and organizational capability that German propaganda could no longer dismiss or explain away. The operation had also revealed the extent to which American military culture had adapted to the demands of modern warfare. The same emphasis on systematic organization and technological solutions that German officers had seen as evidence of American inflexibility had actually provided the foundation for innovations that exceeded anything in German experience. The Red Ball Express represented the triumph of American pragmatism over European military tradition. As German forces retreated toward their homeland in the final months of 1944, they carried with them the bitter knowledge that they had fundamentally misjudged their enemy's capabilities. The Red Ball Express had shown them that American logistics were not the weak point they had assumed, but actually represented a source of strength that German forces could never hope to match. The laughter that had greeted early assessments of American logistical capabilities had been replaced by grudging respect and growing despair. The legacy of the Red Ball Express continues to influence military thinking today, serving as a reminder that logistical innovation can be as important as tactical brilliance in determining the outcome of military campaigns. The operation demonstrated that traditional limitations could be overcome through the application of sufficient resources and innovative thinking, and that assumptions about enemy capabilities based on past performance could prove dangerously misleading. For students of military history, the Red Ball Express provides a perfect example of how industrial capacity, properly organized and directed, can become a decisive factor in warfare. The operation showed that the side with superior logistics could maintain operational tempo and combat effectiveness under conditions that would cripple forces dependent on more traditional supply methods. The story of how German confidence in their logistical superiority was shattered by American innovation serves as a timeless reminder of the dangers of underestimating an enemy's potential for adaptation and growth. The German generals who had dismissed American logistics as inferior learned too late that their assessments were based on incomplete information and cultural biases rather than accurate evaluation of enemy capabilities. The Red Ball Express stands as one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in military history, a testament to American industrial might, organizational capability, and innovative thinking. The operation not only helped secure Allied victory in Western Europe, but also demonstrated principles of logistics and supply that continue to influence military operations today. The German generals who had laughed at American logistics discovered that their laughter was premature and that their enemies possessed capabilities that would ultimately prove decisive in determining the outcome of the war. If you found this exploration of one of World War II's most remarkable logistical achievements as fascinating as I did researching and presenting it, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to Prisoners from History for more incredible stories of innovation, determination, and the moments that changed the course of history. Your support helps us continue bringing these amazing historical narratives to life, and there are countless more stories of human ingenuity and perseverance waiting to be told. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most decisive battles are won not on the front lines but in the supply depots and along the highways where dedicated people work tirelessly to keep the forces of freedom moving forward.